Hello and welcome everyone. We're going to get this webinar started. I'll be recording this session. I'll be making it available shortly afterwards. So by all means, if you miss something here, you'll be able to reference that going forward. And today we're going to be talking about application flow in Wakanda. And there's a number of places where there are events available for you to add logic, JavaScript code. And I just wanted to do a summary um, outlining all of these issues. Now, it's been a bigger topic than I was expecting as I researched for this webinar. So I'll be covering a lot of information. I think I have 30 slides to cover in the next hour. I won't be spending a ton of time in studio. I will do a little bit in order to demonstrate a project that I've put on GitHub that I'm going to encourage you to use as a learning resource. But we're going to go through it as best we can. So let's get started. If you haven't met me, my name is Greg McCarvell. I'm the Director of Business Development for Wakanda. I started out actually as a developer on the Wakanda platform and moved into a role with the team and have been active with Wakanda and developing applications on the platform for close to 2 years now. So I've seen a lot of evolution. I started using it just before version 2 came out. So I've seen it all along the stages, and I know we've got a lot of exciting momentum, a lot of great features coming up. So if you're new to the platform, it evolves very quickly, and definitely keep an eye on it going forward. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's do an overview of Wakanda for anyone who's new and hasn't really explored the platform. Now, I should say before we get started, there is a question section in the software where you can register and post a question. I'm doing this webinar on my own, so I won't be able to really address those until the end of the webinar, but they will be saved there. I'll probably, depending how many questions there are and how the time's looking, if we're going over, I'll probably stop the recording, but I will spend 10 or 15 minutes going through some questions. So if you have questions along the way, put them in the question section and I will definitely tackle those. So for anyone who's new to Wakanda, essentially Wakanda is a full JavaScript stack. We are supplying everything from a data store. It's an object relational data store. It has a lot of great features, and I think that is one of the key strengths. Built into the server is also a web server, so you can serve up static assets. It's an industrial grade web server, very quick. There's a browser framework that includes something similar to Backbone or Angular. If you're familiar with those, it's a client-side data binding framework that also helps translate data to and from the server, makes it very clean and very easy to get data from the data store on the server to your client application, say it's in a browser, etc. There's also a built-in REST server. So if you're into developing even native mobile applications, or you choose to use a different client framework, the REST interface really makes that quite simple. So it's a complete solution. We have a mobile offering, mobile web applications at this point. There is some future announcements coming soon regarding mobile that are very exciting. You're really going to be impressed with what we put on the table on mobile. And obviously we're covering the desktop in the browser as well. And you can learn a lot more about this platform. We've done many webinars in the past, training webinars. We've got extensive documentation, a lot of training materials. And right now, actually, in our store, we have online training that we've had produced that will be available for sale, but it is available free of charge until I believe the end of January. So if you're brand new here, get cracking, and they're meant as a 0 to intermediate level video series. And you can find out everything at wakanda.org. That's our main promotional website for the platform. So let's talk about events in Wakanda. You basically have 5 different categories that I can see. You have model-based events. So everyone who's built an application in Wakanda knows that we really try and create our focus around the model, build our permissions and our security right into the model so that they're consistent and very secure. We also build a lot of events into the model. You can have Datastore class events and attribute events, and I'll be showing you those through this webinar. You have custom server-side events, so you can create events as you would like them to operate based on whatever logic you prefer. On the client side, we have data source events. Data sources are a big part of what I was describing as that mechanism to pull data between the client and the server. And there's a lot of events associated with data sources that I'll be showing you. We have widget events. Each widget has different types of events that you can access. And in fact, when you're building your own custom widgets, and that's a whole nother topic, but you can specify events for your widgets. And then there's custom browser events. Those will be a topic for another day, but certainly an important topic. So what are the benefits of taking an event-based approach to coding your application? I think there's really three main benefits. You always get consistent execution of your logic. So for instance, if you put some code in an on-save event on the server for a particular Datastore class, you know that that logic will always be executed when you're saving an entity of that type, regardless of whether you're applying that save from the Wakanda Ajax framework, so the client-side framework that we provide, whether you're doing it through the REST interface or you're doing it through any other mechanism. It's right in the model, so you know that it'll be executed consistently. It allows you to keep your code dry, so you're not repeating yourself. In particular with the custom events, it allows you to specify your code in an event and emit that event and execute it from different places. So you may have one event that needs to fire in several different use case scenarios. You can write the code once and use that event to access the code from many different places. And then the semantics are easily understood. So when you're coding into an onValidate event, it's quite understood what that's doing. You're validating your entity, or you're saving your entity, or you're removing your entity. It allows you to put some readability into your code and makes things semantically correct. So let's go through some server-side examples. The thing with server-side is they execute immediately, whereas on the client side, you'll get an asynchronous type of scenario. These are executed immediately. How do you access and set up events in Studio? Now, obviously, you can build a Wakanda application using Studio or using different tools. They're all standards files, so it's no concern either way. But for the people who are using our free Studio, which is a big draw, is you can see here we can select a data class or we can select an attribute itself. And in the Events tab, you get a selection of events, and that depends. It's different based if it's a data class event or an attribute event, but you just click these icons and it will place you in the code where the event is stored. Now this is obviously using the guided model. There are definitely code mechanisms if you're using a more hand-coded model, and this whole metaphor here will be adjusted for Wakanda 7. So this code here will change slightly. The functionality remains exactly the same, but we're cleaning up how we do work between the guided model and the freeform model. So that's how you do it in Studio. An important topic on the server side before we get going is handling event errors. I would say that you pretty much always want to do a try-catch structure when you're coding inside of, in particular, an on-remove, on-validate, and on-save event, because there's a lot of use cases where your application will do different functionality and determine that possibly you don't want to save this entity based on your business rules or anything else. So what you do is, for instance, here's a try catch. I've created a person entity, or actually I've found one with the ID 100. And then we put in the try. We try to remove the person, and if it's successful, we populate the message variable with a message that's appropriate. However, if there's an error in the on remove event, or we return an error. You can return your own error based on your logic, is we can catch that error and then return an appropriate message. So keep this in mind. I haven't done this in most of my examples just for brevity, but always keep this in mind that it's a best practice to make sure you're handling errors properly. So the first category I want to talk about is making a collection. And this is as simple as these two examples. dsperson.all, that's just going to query essentially for every person in this Datastore class, or a query looking for every last name starting with G. And basically it hits one event, the data class event on restricting query. And this is a very base level event. It's going to happen every time you try and access an entity or a group of entities. It's going to verify. It's going to go through that on restricting query, and that's a great place for you to implement some permissions logic. So that's making a collection, very simple one. For find entity, and here's some examples of code on the server that basically directly finds an entity. You can go directly to an ID in this fashion, dsperson find. The difference between find and query returns a collection, find actually returns an entity. So it acts a little bit differently. So we're finding an entity with the ID 99, or we can do an array accessor here. This is server side only, dsperson all, so that creates the collection and then directly accesses the first or the entity at the array index 1. And when you do a find, you'll get the same on restricting query, but then it will pile on the data class onload event. So one thing to note, your attribute onload event does not trigger in this case, but we'll get to that going forward. So what about loading an entity on the server? So one thing I'll always include in these examples some setup code just to make sure we've got the variables, but I'm trying to document here or comment where the actual event is starting. So here we've created a collection called all people. And then each of these examples will trigger an onload. So we could go all people first, and that will bring up the first entity. We'll get a data class onload. So we would have got our restricting query in this first line, but I'm trying to be as specific as possible. When you have an existing collection and you do first, or you do an array accessor, you will get an onload. If we do all people for each, which is another API call, we will get the onload for each entity as it loops through. So when we load an attribute, so as a setup, we have an entity that we've already queried for or located or created, and we're going to just access the first name. What you're going to get is you're going to get the attribute event onload. Now, this is an example of a combination. I'll be covering that very soon, but dsperson99, this actually does a find, and then we access the attribute event. So this is actually going to do the previous scenario with an on-restricting query and an entity onload followed by an attribute event onload. So we'll go through those three. So when we're setting an attribute, here we have an existing entity, and then we are assigning a value to the full name. And what will happen is you can assign a value. Calculated attributes have a different set or an additional set of events, on set, on remove, on query, and on sort. So if we set a calculated attribute, the first thing that will fire is the calculated attributes on set. And then for all entities, the attribute on set will fire. So here's an example of a combination on the server. So I have a line here that's doing several things. dsperson all, that's going to do this make collection section, just the on restricting query. The array accessor 1 is going to do a find entity. Now you'll see here in this particular example, it doesn't repeat the on restricting query. So that gets skipped because we just did it here. But we do go through the data class onload. And then when we're accessing the actual attribute, we go through the get attribute. and we get the attribute onload. And then we are assigning a value to that last name. So we'll get the modify attribute um, uh, sequence of events here. So just so you know, in this scenario, uh, in the calculated attribute, I don't know why this is here actually, but there's a look at the code that I have in my full name. So, okay, that's why I said it. In this attribute onload, it will actually trigger for any elements that are within that calculated attribute. So for instance, last name is made up of first name and last name. So these will also do the onload during that calculation of the full name. So as a sequence, what it's going to do is just going to go on restricting query, data class onload, attribute event onload. If it's calculated, it will hit the onset and then the attribute onset. So this line here does a sequence of events. And what I've tried to outline here is some of the more basic levels that you can combine into, let's call it an event path, and really understand what your application is doing. And I think if I were stressing to you, anything that you want to learn and really focus on is you want to understand at the most granular level what these different events are doing and when they're firing. Because if you don't understand them fully, the consequence is that you have bloat. Code will fire when you don't expect or anticipate it to fire, and you'll get things executing 2 and 3 times, which will affect your application performance. So understanding these events and what they do is fundamental to writing a crisp, clean application. Okay, so let's talk about validating an entity. So here I've sourced a person entity in the person. So the person first name will assign a value, and that will obviously fire certain events. But then if we haven't saved or anything, we do the person.validate. And what this is going to do is going to send us through first the attribute, each attribute in the entity. So it will do however many attributes you have in there, repeated. And then at the end, it will do your data class on validate. And I'm just reading one question here. Actually, I'm not going to do that because then I make everyone wait. So we'll just keep going. I'll do questions at the end. So that's validate. Creating an entity. So it's very simple. var the person equals new ds person. So I'm creating a new person entity. What you're going to get is you're going to get a Datastore class on a init event, and then each attribute on init. So you can put code in the class itself, or you can fine grain it right down to each attribute, and it will fire in that order. So save entity. Here is an example of that. We'll get a person entity. We'll change their first name so that we have a value that's been changed, and then we'll just do the person save. Now on the server side, you don't need to do asynchronous, but like I said, you may want to do some try catch in this case. So what a save entity will do is it will do attribute on validate, then the Datastore class on validate, then it will do the data class on save, and then each attribute's on save only if it's been modified. So you'll get each attribute validate, and in each of these scenarios, whether it's the Datastore class or the attribute, you can return an error and make that save, abort that save basically. You can do return an error in this Datastore class on validate, and you can also return errors in the on save. So this is one distinction, one area where an example where you want to make a distinction. When do I use on validate and when do I use on save? So on validate to me is anything that would be, say perhaps the format of an input. Does it match up to what you're allowing in your data? Validating against that. Validating if they have proper permissions perhaps, or anything along those lines. On save to me is any functionality that happens, I would describe it maybe robotically, things that you want automatically to happen. It's already been through the validation, you've covered that the data works, now we're going to do a save, and perhaps there's some cleanup that you need to do along the way. And that would be more of the on save. Okay, so remove entity. Here we are getting a person entity and we're just doing the person.remove. And it's pretty simple here. You go through the Datastore class first and then each attribute, depending how many attributes you have. So this will fire on each attribute's on remove event. So here's an example of a custom server-side event. In the sample project that I'm going to be giving you a link to, I put my script here in the required.js. This is where I defined my custom event. So it's a common JS module. So the first line here is I'm putting into the events variable require the events module. And then in there is an emitter, event emitter. So we're going to, in this variable, create a new instance of the event emitter. And then here we define our, now obviously you could have any number of events, but emitter.addListener, we give the event a name, and this is how we'll reference it. So my event, and then you can pass either a named function, an anonymous function, whatever you want. But this is the functionality that will fire once that event is emitted and the listener picks it up. So then the benefit of this is you can emit that from anywhere. So I could put these in other events. I could put them essentially anywhere that I can write code on the server side. I can emit an event. So I could emit an event when someone hits a certain URL on an HTTP request handler. But the way you emit an event is you take that global emitter variable .emit, and then you specify which event you want to emit, and you can pass an unlimited number of parameters. Perhaps you want to just pass an object with properties, etc. But this is the format here, and like I said, I could have this event emit from an on save of several different types of Datastore classes, so it allows you to keep your code very clean and centralized. So that's a look at custom server-side events. I'd recommend you experiment with them. They're extremely useful. So here are the Datastore class events. We have an on-restricting query, and obviously I didn't fill in these notes here, but I'll just go through them quickly. It's on-restricting query. Event, essentially that is happens every time you try and access an entity. It will validate against, it'll run through that function, and that function returns a collection. So a non-restricting query with no functionality would return ds.person.all. It would return all entities. However, you could do something like return something that's based on a query depending on the account that they're part of. So Welsh just asked if the common JS module is available anywhere. It's actually built into Wakanda. It's just there's certain parts of the server-side framework that are done as common JS modules, and you can see that in the documentation. They're in their own category. Okay, so we've got the on-remove event. Obviously, that's when you're deleting an entity. On validate, we explained on validate and on save. On init. On init is when you create a new entity. So the first thing that happens if you go new ds person, boom, on init's going to happen. Onload is what will happen directly after you try to create an entity into a variable, for instance. So you're loading it from the data store. Okay, we'll get into client-side examples. Data sources and widgets are the primary focus here. So again, a studio overview. What I've got open here is an HTML routing page, so an index page. Data sources are here under the data sources tab, and I've clicked in this image the person data source. Now I could click on the page and have certain events. I could click on a widget and have certain events, but they're all found in this events tab up on the right-hand side of Studio. And when you click on these icons, similarly to the server side, it will direct you to the correct code in the associated JavaScript file for that page. Attribute events are a little bit different. You add them individually. So that's Studio overview. So data sources, and these are client side, and that's one thing that you want to know is that, and I find it's something that newer people to the platform get tripped up with quite frequently, is always pay attention to whether your JavaScript that you're working with, whether the code is client side or server side, because there's a lot in common, which makes the platform very easy to learn and pick up, but there's also some slight differences, so you'll want to keep an eye on that. So that's why I've defined here on each slide whether it's client side or server side. So with data sources, there is an option, if I go back to the screenshot, in this properties tab where you can choose initial query. And if it's selected by default, it's similar to writing your source and then .all in your document Onload. My recommendation is turn it off. I would prefer to be explicit and do this code in my Onload rather than rely on an automatic mechanism. This is my particular view. The thing that's nice about initial query is it gets people up and running and seeing data with less effort. So it's great for that, but I would say when you're building your application, I would tend to stay away from it. So you can access a data store through JavaScript. There's a sources global. So if I have a person source, I would have sources.person, and then I can do my functionality from there. So you can, if you are a person who works with web components, you can localize your name of your sources. And this is a totally different topic, and we do have a couple webinars in our library on working with components that would explain this fully. But the $comp will localize your source name so that you don't get into the extended scoped ID names. And again, go to our web components webinars if you want more information on that. So one thing that you should know as well is widgets can trigger events in data sources. You know, if widgets are bound to your data source, they can trigger events based on user interactions with the widget, or if you modify your widget through JavaScript. So you could do, if you had a combo box or a drop-down list and you select an element of that widget, you could in fact trigger something in your data source. So always be aware of that. And I've got some tips at the end here, you know, where you should consider placing your code and what makes sense in different places. So when you load your page in the browser, certain things happen. You may recognize this code. This is the generated code from a new page. And the first thing you have that happens is you're on after init. So this is a great place for you to define variables, you know, to do any setup routine. And the difference with the onload is this is when essentially the page is ready to go. So you're going to fire through those two events first when a Wakanda routing page of this fashion loads. So you do a refresh, you'll see these two happen. So when we make a collection with a data source, so the code may look like this, sources.person.all. It may look like sources.person.query, and then we query for anyone starting with G. You're going to get this trail of events. And I've done white for server-side function events and green for client-side. So we're basically going to go this way. First thing it's going to do is going to go to the server, do an onRestricting query, do a data class onload for each matching entity. So if your query match, well, I should say for each matching entity that's going to be in the page, because the data source, if you weren't aware, automatically does paging for you. So if you have 500 matches and you've set the default, I think, is 40, what it will do is it will grab the first 40 entities. So it's going to do the onload for each match, on attribute for each attribute of each match, and it does happen in order of definition. Sorry. Okay. Then we will go to the client side. So if you had a previously selected entity, so If your source is brand new and you're creating the first collection for this source, the on before current element change will not fire. Essentially, this event is mostly intended for when you're leaving an entity that you can affect change prior to selecting the next one. So if you don't have a previous selection, then this event won't fire. But if you do have a previously selected entity, the on before current element change will fire. Then you'll go to the on collection change. Then you'll go to on current element change. Now this will actually, a lot of people might not catch this, that this seems to fire twice, but there's a variable when you do on current element change, there's a passed in parameter called event, and event.eventKind is either on collection change or on current element change, and they're two different things. So what I would suggest is some code like this was probably a good idea, where in your on current element change, you are qualifying, am I getting the on current element change event, or am I getting the on collection change? And you may want to do different things. And if nothing else, even just putting in a check for on current element change will make your application a bit quicker by only firing it essentially once. So you'll go through that twice with a different event kind, and then you'll get the on attribute change for all attributes in the order that they're defined. So that's your making a collection with a data source. So let's add an element in a data source. Sources.person.addNewElement. That actually adds one into the current selection of the data source, if you're not familiar with it. Add entity is a different way of doing it. It creates an entity outside of the current selection, or and then you need to add it afterwards, but they both do the same thing. It's all client side, so they don't hit the server at all. You hit source on collection change, then on current element change, and then on attribute change. And it will do it for each attribute. So that's when you're adding an element to a data source. When you're saving from a data source, so you're client side and you want to save changes that they've done, say in the browser, here's some example code. So sources.person.save, and I've done an asynchronous format here, which I'd recommend you do. And after you get the on success, that gives you an opportunity to address what's happened. But when the save is fired, what happens before you get to the on success is it goes to the server, on restricting query, on load, and then these are for each modified or affected calculated attribute, you'll get on load. If it's modified, you'll get an on set and then an on validate. So it will cycle through any changes. Then you get the data class on validate, data class on save, the attribute on save, and then you'll be to the client side. You'll get the source on element saved event, on current element changed, and then on attribute change. Now, one thing to note, server refresh there is identical, and we are working on a solution to allow you to identify when server refresh was called versus save. What server refresh is used for is, say for instance, you have relationships that you've established and you want to pull that related data from the server, or if you have calculated attributes that you want to determine the value, is you can do server refresh. It will act exactly as if you had gone through your save logic, but does not actually save to the data store. So it's a useful command, and I think with that one last little tweak, it will be even more useful. So when you're removing from a data source, again, I've done an asynchronous view here with sources person.remove. You'll go through an onload, so it will first load the entity, run through the data class on remove, the attribute on remove, and then it goes through the current element change routine, which we covered earlier on the client side. So that'll go through a number of steps, and you can refer back to the previous screen. So that's when you're removing. So web components. There's another option in web components that you can choose your component and do a checkbox for load by default. And this has a profound effect on the order in which your events fire. It actually reverses them. My recommendation, similar to the initial query, is just to turn it off. Don't use it. What will happen? What I think is a better route is to physically load your components when you need them. So when it's selected, you get the component load events followed by the HTML documents load events. So it will first go through your component onload and then your document onload. I think the more common use case would be you would want your document onload events to fire and then your component load events happen when you call the load component method. So there's my tip for components. Other than that, sources, data sources, and widgets work the same way within components. So here's some resources. I'm going to attempt to follow this up with a tech note so that there's a written version of some of this information. Obviously, I'm recording this screencast, and I'll post it very soon. And I've also created a project on GitHub, which you can see at this address here. And that's what I use to sort of figure out this information and research it. I'm going to bring it up right now and do a little bit of live in studio examples of how you can understand events, but this is the resource that you can use. So let's talk about some scenarios first. Let's say, for instance, you need to update the browser interface after you save an entity. Where I would recommend you put that is in your data source on element saved event on the client side, because you're talking about the interface in the browser. So I think certainly you want to stick to the client side. And then to me, this is a data based event. It's based on your data. It's based on a change of your data. So that a data source is the place to put this code. Let's say you need to add an entry into a log data class after a save. So you've got maybe a tracks log or something like this. Where I would put something along this line would be in my server side data class on saved event. Reason being is it's totally, it has nothing to do with interface. It's a business rule that will go on the server side. Let's say you need to change the color of an interface item based on the data that's contained in a selected element. So I change, say I click on a grid, and I, based on the status of that particular element in the data grid, I want to change an input form to a different color. That would, in my mind, go in the data source's on current element change. And the data source is your best way to bind information across different widgets. So some people would get caught in putting that in a on row click in the data grid, and that is not the correct way to do things. Where you do use widgets is when you need to affect the widget directly. That's where you do widget events. Or you may affect a data source from within a widget event. So perhaps you have an on click that then calls or does some functionality to a data source. But anytime that you're trying to create events based on a change of data, that's the way I would classify it, is you really want to think, where would that fit in my data source, and where would be the best place to put that? And that really is one of the key questions in defining an application that's behaves predictably, is easy to maintain, is putting your code in the most semantically correct place. What is the true meaning of the code you're doing, and put it in the correct event based on that. For instance, if we needed to see the value of an input widget as the user types, I would put that in a widget on key up event. Data sources do not synchronize with input in a real-time way. But if I needed to, say, for instance, do a live search, what I would do is in my widget, the text input, I would go to on key up, and I would do a sources.name.query within that on key up event. And what that will give me is access to the text as the person is typing. So widgets on the client. Just because of the size and scope of this, I haven't done a lot. We're going to do a little bit of demonstration with Studio in a second, but They all have very different types of events, depends on the type of widget it is. I'd keep your code within these events to UI logic. Really be militant about making sure that the code you put in a widget event is specifically for UI purposes. And then, widgets have I already said they have varied events based on types. So I wonder if is that my last slide? That is my last slide. So let's go into Studio and I'll show you what I've put together. I'd encourage you to download this project. It's nothing fancy, but it took a bit of work together. Let's go here to, I'm going to go right from GitHub. I'm going to clone it. I've got my credentials in there. And this is the address I gave you earlier. So github.com/micwakanda, which is my username, slash, and I think it's server. Hold on one second, make sure I get it right. Here's the repo anyhow, server event order. So server event order.git, and we're just going to put it on the desktop. And there's the project. So let's go into the index here, and I'll just get rid of what's there. So you can see I have a person data source here, and all I've done is, if we look at the scripts, well, I guess we can go here to events. As you can see, I've just basically implemented every possible event. And if you go here to the model side, into my model.js, I guess I can go to my model. You can see when you click on the person data store class, in each event I've implemented, just made the event fire. In certain attributes, I've made every event fire. And in particular on the full name, also in the properties is where you find these specific events for a calculated attribute. So I've implemented those as well. And it just looks like a big mess here. On the server side, I just put a debugger in every single event so that I could see how it works. It would stop specifically at each one, and that's how I went about determining exactly how things function. And I would recommend, pull down this project, and if you want to understand a specific scenario, put it into this project in some format and see the path that it takes. So we're on the client side, and this will bring up the JavaScript attached to this. As you can see, I've just done the same thing. On the client side, I use console.log instead. But let's go to, let's go to the browser, and let's not even use Wakanda Studio for a minute here. I'm going to do a reload. I probably need to start the server, would be a good idea. I will start. And we'll go to our page. So here's our blank page, and you can see that two console.logs have already gone, the WAF on after init and the onload. So that's telling you right now, when I load my page, that's what happens. If I go sources.person.all and I hit enter here in the console, you'll see that I have the Wakanda debugger pops up, and we're going to go through each event on the server side first, which was only on restricting query. And then you get the console.log for each event that it went through. So just to point this out, I raised this as an issue. I believe we may have some redundancy in attribute events on the client side, but we'll be looking at that very soon. Let's do a little bit more. So we could go, we now have, so we could go sources.person, because we have a current entity from our last command, person.firstName equals Sam. And I don't actually know if I have any elements in here. And then we go sources.person.save. and I don't have any entities. So the other thing we can do here is if we go to Wakanda Studio, I generally keep a server-side JavaScript file handy in each of my projects just for testing. So you can tell it's server-side by the fact that it's not in the web folder. So we can just do some test code here directly against the server. So we could go var myPerson equals new ds.person and then pass in some values. First name is Charlie and last name is Brown. And then on the next line, we'll do, actually what I'll do is I'll do a debugger here, and then I'll do myPerson.save. If we run this, what you'll see is first thing, it's doing onInit, attribute onInit. You can see the attribute name here is first name. Then it's going, oh, this one actually, I have a custom event in my onInit of person, which I forgot to show you. So I do have one in there, so you can see that the custom event fires, and I'll show you where that is shortly. And then we do the onInit of the attribute, onInit of full name, so it's going through each attribute. Then it's doing the onload, onset because we've changed the first name, do the same for last name, and then so that you can see the sequence of events from this first line that we just went through. Now we've stopped. Now it's going to do a different set of events for the save. So this is just how you go about understanding what's happening. We're in the onValidate for the entity, for each entity. You can see them changing up here. Then we're on the onValidate for the Datastore class, onSave for the attribute, and they go inside out, and then we're done. So you can see now we've got, if we do, now what I'll do just so it's not so annoying, I'll turn off the debugger on the server, is we can do ds.person.all, and there's our Charlie Brown. So this is the way, now to show you that one that came up, if I go to my model.js and I bring up my, specifically in scripts with a capital S, required, this is the a default JavaScript file that's evaluated on startup. You can see here's where my event was declared. And then in my model.js, here in the person last name init is where I'm emitting my event. So you can see how that fired as well. So now that we've got the debugger off on the server side, we won't see the debugger come up anymore when I'm doing my browser side examples. So let's do something with some widgets, and I'll show you how they interact a little bit. And again, my recommendation to you is just start experimenting with things, and the best way to learn is to do it firsthand. So I've created a grid. I'm going to assign the person data source. We'll save that. We'll go to the browser. We'll reload. So there's our grid. So if we do sources.person.all, okay, there's the events. So we can go through and find out exactly what happened. Now what I'll point out is, see, onCollectionChange is our first one. If I clear this and do the exact same command right afterwards, I'll just do up arrow, you can see now my first one is on before current element change, and that was the one difference I specified to you, is it's only when you're switching from one to the next. We can add a new one, and you can see as you do this, you're seeing the events happen. So let's go Wanda here, and you can see you can really discover how things are happening. And there you go. So this is the learning resource I would leave with you, is this project, and spend some time and really understand what's going on. I hope I've given you a good overview. We have a few questions here, so I'm going to go through them quickly. I'm going to turn off the recording though. So this will be available soon, and I really appreciate you tuning in. I've done a survey at the end of this webinar. I'd appreciate if you did give us some feedback, because we're looking the best way we can serve you going forward.